Good afternoon and welcome to our Evergreens in the Landscape class today. There's just a few of you so far. We expect others to be joining us, but appreciate you taking time on an afternoon today to join us. There's a little bit of, maybe it's sad irony in today's topic of evergreens when we've had these massive windstorms and many evergreens are laying on the ground today and yesterday. So we're actually going to, that's a very valid point and something we're going to bring up today in the class about choosing appropriate trees for the right spaces and the right conditions. So welcome, my name's David Rice. I'm here with Weaver Basin Water Conservancy District. We've got Janice Terry and Brody Tate assisting on kind of some of the back end stuff of the class, and Robin Ward will be assisting me in teaching portions of this class today. So I appreciate them. And so we'll just kind of jump right into this. Oh, a little bit of housekeeping type of things. If you have some questions as we begin this and start going, on your controls, you should see on your computer and in your controls a Q&A button at the bottom, or wherever you have those controls, just Q&A. It's a question answer. Rather than interrupting with different people and trying to coordinate who can speak and the voice through stuff, if you'll just type your question through that Q&A button, we will answer those questions as we go. Whoever's not presenting can answer the questions. And then if there's some questions at the end that we haven't covered, we'll address those at the end. So also this class will be recorded. The slides will be available if you just want to peruse through the slides of this. You can get those later, as well as the entire presentation recorded. Both will be posted on our website. It takes a day or so to get all that prepped and get on our website. So if you need to go back and reference something, please do that. It'll be recorded and posted. So with that, I think we'll just jump right in and we'll just get going on the presentation. So with evergreens, evergreens are an amazing group of plants, and they cover a wide range of different plant material, different genus and species and families of plants. And evergreens, most of us think of evergreens as the conifer type trees, but we're going to talk about a lot of different things today to kind of show you the broad range of evergreens and their use in a landscape. We will talk about some of the very, very large trees that you see maybe laying on the ground today. And we'll talk about more small varieties and dwarf varieties that are probably a little more suitable to our landscapes now, along the Wasatch Front as areas grow, as landscapes shrink, different things like that for those different situations. So let's first talk about some growing conditions. There's, cold hardiness is always an issue when you're considering the conditions for evergreens. Zones 4 and 5 are kind of very typical on the valleys of the Wasatch Front. If you live in the upper valleys, you'd be a possible zone 3. The very, very high elevations, you might get into zone 2. So most of everything that I'm talking about today that will be involved here is suitable for the growing conditions of the Wasatch Front, and some of them to the higher valleys. And so you want to think about exposure of where you're placing the evergreens. Some of them are really tolerant of almost any condition, but some are a little more sensitive to winter conditions that we'll talk about. I have one more slide coming up. So you want to think about these exposures. You don't necessarily want some evergreens on that hot south side. They can get winter burn. And we'll talk about all of these things as we go. Fertility, most evergreens, at least the conifer type evergreens, prefer very well drained, looser soils. Some prefer very rocky soils, and this is evidence of what you see in the wild. Up in the high elevation, very rocky terrain, you'll see evergreen plants. You'll see trees and shrubs growing in these conditions where the soils are very rocky, very loose, and the issue there is mostly the drainage. These plants do not like to be sitting in soggy conditions. So if you have a really heavy clay soil, you're going to have to really watch the water to be able to provide for these plants in a way that they're going to thrive instead of just living for a couple years and dying. Soil pH, we're not going to spend a lot of time on pH. There's not a lot of information on pH on the slides, but generally a neutral pH. And here along the Wasatch Front, we might be a slightly alkaline, depending on where you are, to neutral. So, Sorry about this. It looks like you're not seeing my slides. So I'm gonna quickly switch here. And someone will tell me if you're not seeing the current slides. Okay, I think we're good now. Sorry about that minor technical difficulty. We've only gone one slide in. You haven't missed anything. So some evergreens are tolerant of less ideal conditions. Oh, I was talking about pH. Most pH issues aren't an issue. We don't have very acidic soils. We mostly have alkaline soils. So if you have a heavy alkaline soil, you may run into some issues because a lot of these conifer evergreen type trees and shrubs prefer slightly acidic to more neutral. And so if you're really worried, get your soil tested and know what the pH is. Evergreens are very tolerant of also some different conditions. Some tolerate low water, some tolerate very poor soils, just really harsh conditions, as evidence again in nature. You look at where these plants grow, and some of them can tolerate some real extreme conditions. So let's talk about, whoops, sorry about that. Let's talk about some of the winter problems. So in our climate here, it's not so much the temperatures that create the issue. We get the wind, it's the sun and the angle of the sun and how it can warm up, because these plants don't drop their foliage. They can tend to warm up in the daytime, and then as soon as the sun sets, it gets instantly cold, instantly freezing. So that heating and freezing and heating and freezing can tend to cause burn, winter burn. And so sometimes you even get bleaching or drying out of that foliage on dry winters. Evergreens can really struggle because they need a little bit of extra water. They're still doing transpiration and these processes. They haven't completely shut down, so they may need a little extra water. You can get bark damage, again, on the southern exposures, but bark heating up during the day and then freezing at night. And then sometimes you just get heavy snow that can break down some branches and do some different things like that. You've seen heavy snow break branches and topple trees. One other issue is in our climate with salt along walkways and roadways, de-icing and stuff like that. Some of these plants are a bit susceptible to that salt. And so you'd want to be very careful if as you do your little homework to buy these plants and ask some of these questions. If you're planting this right along a very heavily salted roadway or sidewalk, you may want to consider some different options so that you're not going to do some harm to these trees and have them very short-lived. All right, so other issues can be deer, rodents, rabbits, different animals that may feed on some of this stuff. Most of the time, those aren't causing a problem. Most of the time, they're actually using these evergreens for food. But in a year where food is scarce for these animals, they can tend to browse on even needled. You wouldn't think deer would be much interested in these needles, but on a food shortage type year for these wildlife, sometimes they are browsing and eating these trees and shrubs. All right, so let's, sorry, I gotta move my screen out of here so I can see this just a little bit. So choosing the right size plant for the right space. As we've seen just from these recent winds, some very large evergreens blown over. It's really important to know what the mature size of the tree will be. When we all go shopping at a nursery, sometimes we see this perfect little specimen and it's 4 feet tall. We're like, oh, that is beautiful, I'm gonna buy it. Not realizing that thing in 15 to 20 years may be 50 feet tall or 30 feet tall. And its maturity at 20 years may be 60 feet tall and 30 feet wide. So pay attention to the mature size of the plant, and then you'll be able to choose the right plant for the right space. Now I've listed here spruce, fir, and arborvitae are more pyramidal shape. They can get large, or there's some very small varieties, and we're going to talk about those small ones. Many evergreens they do get huge, and the great big trees, we just love them. They're big, they're stately, they can provide nice screening, nice shade, they just look really nice. But again, it's very important to choose the right tree for the right space to avoid potential problems, property damage, and different other issues that come. So pines can be pyramidal as they're young, but as they mature, they often lose some of those lower branches. They tend to start to broaden out at the top. And some pines can get very broad. They can be almost more broad than they are tall. So that's one consideration when considering some pine trees. All right, so plant sizing continued. Some smaller upright juniper or columnar arborvitae are often more to scale with residential landscapes. We're seeing landscapes going now that are, a tenth of an acre, very small landscape areas, but you still want some evergreens. You still may be looking for that conical shape, something to provide a little, a little architectural structure against a home to soften some things. And there are some small varieties that'll stay below 30 feet, 20 feet, some even to 10, depending again on the varieties. And we're going to cover many of those varieties and show you some good examples today. Juniper shrubs in horizontal shapes, they can spread. We're going to talk about junipers really importantly because they've got kind of a bad rap, I think, over the years. And there's some really good varieties of junipers that serve really nice purposes in a landscape. And then we'll talk about some yews and different things like that that can be pruned. Not every evergreen loves to be pruned or trimmed back. So you want to be a little bit careful. You don't want to just take your hedge shears out and start, hedging away your evergreens. Not all of them like that, and some will do some damage and never repair. But others thrive and they like that pruning, or they'll tolerate it well, and they make, they can densen up and make nice hedges or tight shape to them. So let's talk about, I'm just going through some general slides here, and then I'm gonna transition, and Robin's gonna jump in and start talking about the dwarfs. So I've got just a couple more slides here on just some general things. Evergreens are one of those great plants that provide year-round color and texture. So that's why, as we chose some topics for classes, our broader, bigger goals are trying to help you have a beautiful landscape that's also water efficient, that's also less maintenance, that you can really enjoy. You're creating outdoor spaces, you're creating entertainment spaces, and you need various plants to meet not only a need, but an aesthetic appeal. So evergreens can provide a lot of the different things that you can't get from flowering plants. And the great thing about that is those characteristics are there year round. So you're looking at, the shape, pyramidal shape versus spreading versus mounded, a little rounded, a little bit of weeping forms. All of those things in the texture and shaping really add aesthetic interest and appeal. Your evergreens can also provide, this color, as this picture illustrates, some of the really bright, I shouldn't say bright, it's just unique colors of silvery blue to more yellow. Now, yellow is sometimes associated with disease. It has been historically, like, oh man, my tree is yellow, it's got a problem. But there are some cultivations now that are being bred and grown, have this really unique yellow color, and it's intentional to provide this nice contrast, this nice color that's there year round. And they're not diseased, they're healthy, they look great. So choosing evergreens, consider the following then: foliage, bark, cones, and berries. And we'll talk about a few of them that have the berries. Consider your sunlight. Some evergreens do really well in shade, where others need some good direct sunlight to do their best. And consider the age and the pace at which they grow. Some evergreens are going to be really slow, and they're considered dwarf only because they may only grow an inch per year. And so in 10 years, you've only grown 10 inches. And so over 50 years, you've only grown 50 inches. And so they're dwarf because they grow so slow, where others may put on 2 feet a year. So always consider that growth rate as well. And then for good visual appeal, just avoid combining evergreens that, my slide is hidden, evergreens with the same or very similar colors and textures, because you want the contrast, you want the differences that you can get from different varieties and different forms of those plants. All right, so let's talk about a little bit for difficult sites. I mentioned earlier about soils and conditions of well-drained soil and stuff. So here's kind of a general list of just a few types of evergreens that are going to do well in some varied conditions. So if you have a clay soil, heavy, then you're going to be looking at plants like Arborvitae. Austrian pines will tolerate heavy clay, ponderosa pine, and white fir. The downside to that is all of those except Arborvitae are big trees. Now, if you find some cultivations of those trees, they'll also do fairly well in a heavier soil. For sandy soils, Scotch pines, mugle pines, junipers, actually most evergreens are going to do okay in a loose sandier soil. If it's just straight sand, you're going to need a little supplemental water and extra water to help them along, because they don't also want to be completely dried out. Wet soils, this is really pretty limited. Black spruce, balsam firs, and American Arborvitae are a few that tolerate very wet soils. And then your high pH soils, Arborvitae, Black Hill spruce, Mugle pine, ponderosa pine, juniper. Windy exposed areas. Now this is a big one we've just witnessed and had. So you want to look for some, I mean, some of these will tolerate, but every site's a little different, and some of those are going to be dependent. So I've got listed here: Black Hill spruce, jack pine, Mugle pine, red pine, ponderosa pine, Rocky Mountain juniper, Savin juniper, eastern red cedar, and Douglas fir. Now, just today, there are Douglas fir and ponderosa pines on the ground, as well as Austrian pines. I've got a ponderosa pine in my backyard that's now leaning at a, at a certain angle. It didn't go all the way over, but it's going to have to be taken down because now it's really not stable anymore. And it's about 40 feet tall. So, depending on where you live, doesn't mean some of these will tolerate very windy conditions, but when we have the type of force of winds that we just had, you're still going to want to consider some smaller options. Every large tree I've taken out of my yard, I've replaced it with something that's going to be smaller, that won't reach that height again, and I won't have those potential problems for future wind events. So if you've got some partial sun conditions, you look at those there, and possible shade conditions, there's the yews, the different varieties of yews, and Canada hemlock that thrive in almost completely shaded conditions. All right, so with that, we've kind of reached this step here. Those are some general conditions. I'm going to turn the time over to Robin, and she's going to go through several slides of a lot of really great dwarf conifers that are going to work for smaller landscapes.
Thank you. Thanks for having me today. And talking first about dwarf conifers is probably I'm most excited about, just because they are so adorable in the landscape. And as Dave had mentioned, we are experiencing, more condensed residential living, and it's nice to be able to have these beautiful options in the landscape that give a great textural and structural difference within the landscape. So first, here we have examples of false cypress. You'll see so many different textures here and colors. When we talk about dwarf evergreens, we are really talking about ranging from 1 to 6 feet tall and in the width. So those would be exceptional, to adding to the landscape and not overwhelming your landscape as well. So here we have the blues weeping Colorado spruce. Anything with this blue, I would say silver foliage is just so beautiful, and look at it against that pink foliage that's right in front of it. This variety tops just about 10 feet in height, is about 5 to 10 feet in width. And like I mentioned, the blue-green needles are quite beautiful, and this variety is deer resistant, which we know is something to consider along the Wasatch Front and in our areas. This Hinoki cypress, the compact, extremely slow grower, the needles are softer, but you can see how the one in the background can be planted in a pot. And with that structure in the pot is just so beautiful, to where you can move it in your landscape, put it up on a larger porch. They are extraordinarily winter hardy. I think a lot of these that we're showing are winter hardy, up to at least 40 to 30 below. This one, again, gets to 10 to 12 feet tall. Now we have the Chalet Swiss stone pine, another good example. This one would be an exceptional choice, as it reaches about 8 feet height and 4 feet wide, and it has such a beautiful form to it, and it's slow growing. It's just a nice variety of dwarf evergreen. Here we have the dwarf Serbian spruce. It's, as you can see from the example, it's very dense, and it is a great choice for small garden beds and foundational plantings. Slow growing, maximum height 3 feet, and then equals in width. It has just such a beautiful, nice pyramidal structure to it. And this is, I love the weeping varieties. This green arrow weeping Alaska cedar is just so interesting. It gives great interest in height in the landscape. This will top about 20 feet, but still a really great option since it's just so tall and narrow and slender. And just, yeah, I just love that weeping look. Here we have the North Star dwarf white spruce. Again, extremely hardy to 50 below, and you'll see the pyramidal in shape and covered with the green needles. Again, a very good deer-resistant variety. And this one requires no pruning. As Dave had mentioned earlier, you know, a lot of evergreens don't require a lot of pruning, and they don't like, you know, just more the natural form is what you want in the landscape. Sorry, I should go back. I skipped one and I'm not quite sure how to get back to it. Oh, thank you. This upright Japanese plum yew is quite interesting. As you'll see, you'll have the very vertical branches and then the needles that elongate off of it. And I think that would add a lot of nice interest. This is only gets about to 8 feet tall, 3 feet wide, and it thrives in partial sun. So if you have a persnickety spot in your garden that maybe has a little more shade, this would do quite well in that landscape. Here we have such a cute little dwarf balsam fir. It's rounded, you know, very squat, rounded fir with lush needles. Like other balsam firs, this is compact, is a great selection for the dark green needles and densely packed branches. Again, reaches about 5 to 6 feet wide. This is one of my favorite choices, this Blue Wonder Blue Spruce. As I had mentioned, I think it's just so nice having some sort of gray or blue in the landscape, and it's such a nice compact, that pyramid shaped form would be a lovely option. It looks like it grows slow at about 6 feet, topping out at 6 feet in height. This green penguin dwarf Scotch pine, it looks like a little chunky dwarf evergreen, super cute. The needles look feathery, and I don't know, it just would bring great texture into the garden. This dwarf pencil point juniper, another example of something that you would want, either if you wanted something slender with a little more height, even though the height is about 5 feet, sun-loving, again, those blue-green needles. And then this is a variety where the female plants may produce blue, quote-unquote, berries. And in the winter, it's about hardy to 40 below. This cute little gem spruce, you know, tight, rounded habit, no trimming or cutting to maintain the shape. And at maturity, it looks like it's about 5 feet tall. And this would be super cute in like something more formal. Again, here's another one, a dwarf globe Norway spruce. Again, something very similar, grows 3 to 5 feet tall. In about 10 years, this will tend to get taller and the center will taper outward. A taller center and taper outward, excuse me. The dwarf blue Scotch pine. This is another great choice for full sun, deer resistant, very low growing, and it has that bright bluish green needles, which is super attractive. The sea urchin eastern white pine, I love this because of that very soft, it looks just very soft needles, soft to the touch. It says that it is also rabbit resistant, and it just has a really nice rounded form and compact. And here we have Mr. Bowling Ball Dwarf Cedar. This is another very small, growing 2 to 3 feet high, same in width. With this one, it does mention that the foliage may show some winter burn, so that would be something to consider. But it has a average growth and does well with well-drained soils. Here, I'll turn it back over to Dave to talk more about pines.
All right, thanks, Robin. So now we kind of arranged this presentation a little bit. That first little section, notice that it was kind of all over the place as far as if it was a pine, if it was a cedar, if it was juniper. I'm now going to go through specific sections of evergreen. So we're going to talk about pines. Now, I didn't mention before Robin took over there as well. That's just a small sampling of the types of dwarf evergreens that exist. You can find almost any type of, if you're looking for a specific shape or size, you can find almost anything you need. Now, you might have to settle for a juniper instead of a pine for a certain shape or size, but there is an evergreen variety of something that would fit almost any of your desired needs. If it's just considering shape, size, or color, you could find anything to fit. So with that, we're going to jump into the pines. Now, pines are there's a lot of pine trees out there. Now, a lot of times people in general, if it has needles and cones, they're just like, oh yeah, the pine trees. And that's not always the case. There's a lot of spruces and firs and other types of evergreens out there, but pines get kind of, they get the glory, I guess, because everyone calls all the cone-bearing trees pines. But these are important in ornamental value in the landscape, but wildlife also rely on the cones and the seeds that those produce. And then there's commercial value, the lumber and the Christmas trees and so many things from pines that are really valuable in part of the tree industry in general for so many reasons. So as I mentioned, I'm going to talk about some really large trees. I'm going to talk about some small trees. I should say, almost in every case, like the family, the genus, Pinus, and then there's a species, so genus and species name, there's going to usually be a dwarf cultivation of that variety, so that genus. So if I'm talking about Austrian pine, in this case, was 60 feet tall and 40 feet wide at maturity, there are cultivations and dwarf varieties as I've listed here. Now, I haven't done that on every single one of them, but if you look at a local nursery, if you like the characteristics of an Austrian pine, there's more than likely a dwarf variety of that tree that you can find. And the dwarfs carry all kinds of characteristics. They can be just a little bit shorter. They could be really short and rounded. They could even be prostrate and across the ground type plants. But there's many different options. So please consider that as we go through some of these. And there's no way we can possibly cover all the types of trees and every cultivated variety. There are potentially thousands of these. Not all of them are sold in local nurseries. Wholesale growers may grow these and they're selling them in different places, different parts of the country for their different characteristics. But look around, you can do some research on the internet and find things and then ask local nurseries to bring them here. But an Austrian pine is a very big pine. If you don't have space for a very big tree and the site conditions not suitable, don't grow this one. Grow a dwarf variety of this one. And it grows pretty fast too, at 20 inches, potentially 20 inches per year. But it is a great drought tolerant tree, some other characteristics like that. This and ponderosa pine look very similar, other than Austrian pine gets much broader. Ponderosas tend to be a little taller and more upright. Mugo pine or Swiss mountain pine. Now the Swiss mountain pines, Swiss mountain pine and Mugo kind of are used synonymously, but then Robin showed you a little dwarf variety of a chalet mountain pine, or anyway, there's some that kind of carry some of the similar characteristics, so don't necessarily get confused. But Pinus mugo is all the Mugo family species, I should say. And anyway, the Mugos have a huge range. These can be little teeny dwarf things to potentially even getting 20 feet tall. If it's just a regular Mugo with no dwarfing or nothing in it, it can be big. But there are some great little Mugo pines that stay really small. They grow very slow, and they're meant to be nice little green, rounded, mounded or very small conical trees in your landscape. Great drought tolerance and maturity, grow well in most sites. Here's a few varieties of mugos because I felt, yeah, now that as I go through these, sometimes I remember what I won't remember what the next slide is, but I put some in here because there's so many. So I've listed shown a few pictures here of the couple varieties, different varieties, and then just a list of some of those varieties and some of their characteristics. And as I mentioned, we're not going to be able to read every word of every slide because of time, but you'll be able to go back and reference some of these as we go along if you need more information. So I threw this one in here just because we have one of these in our learning garden here, and I've seen them around. I just think it's a cool looking shrub / tree, Tanyosho pine or Japanese umbrella pine, and they're slow growing. They have this really nice reddish orange exfoliating bark, moderate water need. I think they just look really cool, kind of the shape. Notice the two different pictures here. You can kind of prune some things up at the lower branches to create a little bit of a canopy look. At maturity, they could be up to 20 feet tall. I don't think in our climate they'll get that tall. I've never seen one that tall, but they potentially could. I think ours in our garden right now is in the range of maybe 8 feet tallish and the same wide maybe. But it's slowly growing every year. It grows a little more. Bristlecone pine. Now, if you're from the area, you know the Great Basin, the bristlecone pine is a native plant in the Great Basin, and it's one of the oldest living tree species out there. It's been cultivated now for landscape use. The true species can get quite large. Cultivations of this are meant to be small, about 10 to 15 feet, 10 feet wide, very irregular shape. They're not your typical conical shaped tree. They can get kind of irregular, but they really do have a very nice needle foliage type look to them, a moderate to very low water usage, really used for as kind of a specimen tree. Just a neat tree to be used in a water efficient landscape or as that specimen. Now, white pine, I've thrown this one in here just because a lot of pines kind of, they have that 2-inch needle, kind of an average needle length. And other than shape, they kind of look the same. Bark is kind of a similar look and so forth. But white pine has a really long needle to it. They can have a big, long 4-inch needle, very soft texture, anyway, just a very unique looking tree. Soft blue-green needles, fast grower, up to 2 feet per year. These can get really, really large, again, unless you're using a dwarf variety of these. Very suitable for our conditions here. They grow well. They prefer full sun. Here's a Japanese umbrella pine. Now, this is a little bit unique. We just found one of these in the nursery a couple of years ago, and we put it here in our learning garden. So right now we've got one here. It's probably about 4 feet tall. And but such a unique little whorl of needles, almost a little umbrella shape as they come out. Very soft, slow grower. They can get, according to the books, 20 to 30 feet high. I've never seen one that big because I'd never really seen these until just a couple of years ago. So in our climate, maybe they won't grow quite as large, or maybe they will. You'd always want to plan just in case, plan for that. They love the sun, very soft green shape. One thing we've noticed from ours is in the heavy winter, the way the branching structure is, they can tend to open up with heavy snow. So just a loose wrapping around those in the winter time will keep those branches upright, keep them from opening up a bit. That's just what we learned from our variety, our tree right here in the garden. Limber pine. Now there's a few cultivations of this, but it's Vanderwolf's pine. It's all in this same group of limber pine. Pyramid in shape, soft bluish needles, very flexible branches. That's why it gets the name limber pine. Those branches can just bend down, go back up. It's a fast grower, moderate size. We've got several of these in our garden here that are probably approaching maturity, and they're probably on that 30 feet tall mark. Maybe not even quite as wide, 10 feet wide, 30 feet tall. Beautiful trees, nice shape, tolerant. If you're in an area that gets heavy snow or you don't want to bother wrapping them, these do great in that condition. Very flexible. Lacebark pine has such a very unique mottled bark look to it, and I think that's one of the reasons this one would be grown. Doesn't necessarily have other fantastic characteristics, but if you just look at those pictures of the bark, just such an interesting bark you don't get in so many different plants. So to have this unique bark look to it, as well as the evergreen characteristic, it would be worth considering in the right site. Maximum height on this 20 to 30 feet, 20 feet wide, so not a conical shape. As it's young, it will be, and then it's going to broaden out like many pines do. This one prefers moist but well-drained soils, but it can tolerate a little bit of drought. But it's not one that's just going to be going without water, every single summer, all the time. You'd want to give it some supplemental water and water it with other perennials or shrubs or trees. Several cultivations of this one, nice tree. Pinyon pine, also a native here in Utah. There's a couple different species of this one. You've got a 2-needle pinyon and a single needle pinyon, and they grow in kind of some different places of the state. You got pinyon pine that grows all over southern Utah in the Colorado Plateau areas and up in Box Elder County, and it kind of at a certain elevation you see this naturally. But these are cultivated; they're now sold in the nursery trade, relatively slower growing, and you can see this one's a little bit conical shape. But then as it broadens out at maturity, these kind of have a very irregular broad shape as they're old. A lot of people, at least I grew up in southern Utah, a lot of people would cut pinyon pines for Christmas trees when they're young, make a thick, kind of a little bit wider Christmas tree. And then they would also cut these for firewood when they're dead. It has a very, very sappy, pitchy type wood to it. A lot of people just burn these as firewood. So interesting tree, beautiful tree. It's also the tree that produces the edible pine nut that you might be familiar with. That you try to buy that along roadside stand, very valuable pine nut. And that's what the pinyon pine produces, those pine nuts. Very hardy tree, very drought tolerant tree, suitable in the landscape if you understand that it's going to broaden out, widen out, and have that unique shape to it. Scotch pine, another big tree at maturity, although there's some nice dwarf varieties. This one, the needles kind of change a little bit of color in the winter, not dramatic, but they change a little bit of color, and it's really known for its reddish bark. It has a really nice contrasting reddish bark to it, and it prefers well-drained soils. I've pictured here a dwarf kind of creeper variety called hillside creeper, and we have a few of these in our garden right here as well, and they're not more than maybe 3 to 4 feet tall, and then they kind of broaden out. Hillside creeper being if you had a hillside or some area where you've got quite a bit of room to grow outward but not upward, this would be a great thing, a great plant. Nice color, nice texture. So black pine or Japanese black pine, very conical in shape when it's young, 20 to 25 feet, 25 to 30 feet, excuse me. Long-lived, relatively fast grower, tolerant of most soils. Now notice the one picture, it's not really the natural occurring. These have kind of been pruned and shaped just a little bit. Although there are cultivations of Japanese black pine that naturally do that in their characteristic. They're not pruned that way. They actually kind of just grow out and end up with the tufts of needles out on the ends. So if you're looking for something like that, always look for a cultivation of the original species, and then you'll be able to find some of the unique characteristics that you might not see in the true species of the plant. Red cone pine or Bosnian pine. Now these, notice they're pretty dense, and this is Pinus hildrethii, medium growth rate, needs kind of medium water, but is drought tolerant. These can get large, again, up to about 70 feet in maturity. Tolerate most soil conditions. Almost all of these are going to say good drainage. So, hopefully, if you've got a heavier site, some things you can do to promote a little bit of drainage is actually just add some looser material. Some people have said, this is not the scientific thing, but some people have said you can actually put some rocks and some gravel and something in with your soil and dump that back into the hole. At the bottom of the hole to give a little extra drainage so water's just not sitting and like a pot of water there and just sitting there and causing your tree to suffer. So I'm going to move on. If there's any questions about pines, I've kind of gone through that quickly and shown just a few of the different species of pines. I'm going to go through firs and spruces, and then I'm going to turn it back over to Robin to go through several others. So firs, very soft needled. They have cones that kind of go upright. They're used in the Christmas industry, Christmas trees, and very, very much so in the landscape industry. Now, one analogy for people that want to know the difference between maybe firs and spruces, we can kind of tell the difference between pines. They look different, but firs and spruces sometimes look like, firs are soft needled and spruces are usually pointy and prickly. They're not very soft. And so that's kind of, you can tell the difference between a fir and a spruce, mostly between the soft needles. Firs also have kind of a flattened needle, and then the cones also kind of give it away. But let's talk about white fir. Beautiful tree. This can be a very large tree, but there are small cultivations of this tree. And this is one of my favorite evergreen trees. I don't necessarily know why. I think it's just because it has such a nice conical shape. It has a nice soft texture. The color of it's just really, really good as far as the blue, silvery blue. Just a beautiful tree. And we've got actually a species of this in the garden, and it's growing. It's probably 20 feet tall now, and we expect it to get taller. But again, if you don't have the space for one of these, then look for a cultivation of this, and you can still get the great characteristics, but something smaller. I have a neighbor that has one of these, and it is certainly 60 feet tall. Very big tree, beautiful tree, but super large. And if that ever comes down in the wind, it's going to be a giant mess. Douglas fir, this is a kind of a typical, you'll see these up in the mountains, a little higher elevation stuff, but they can grow in the valleys as a landscape tree. They're attractive, they're fast growing. There are cultivations of Douglas fir as well. So I'm just showing you some of the examples and what you could expect from different types of trees. Douglas firs, you're kind of just getting that typical green, a little bit of the grayish blue green, but just mostly green. Canaan balsam fir, nice, and you can tell from the pictures, there's kind of the different looks, a little softer textured looks, not as dense. All of the firs typically have a conical, very nice conical shape with good coloring. This one can be 40, 50 feet, 55 feet tall and fairly wide. Again, just some more examples. Fraser fir. This is a very, very common one in the Christmas tree industry, all over the place. And it's, they cut them when they're small, and they actually trim some of the ends up, to make them even more conical. But they're naturally very conical, flat needles, dark green. We've got one here in the garden, and it's been really slow growing, and it may be because of the soil conditions exactly where it's planted, and maybe some of how we're watering it. It hasn't grown much over the course of, I'd say, 5 or 6 years. It's put on very little growth. It's actually struggled a little bit, and we're not sure if maybe we're underwatering it or maybe we're overwatering it. We're going to figure that out this year and see what's going on. But a beautiful tree. And if, like I said, if you buy a Christmas tree from a lot or something, likely it's probably a Fraser fir. Now, that was just a quick sampling of firs. Now notice I didn't show you any small ones in there. All of those firs are very large. But again, all of them will have some dwarf cultivars as you look for firs. Now, one thing I didn't point out is the fir genus name is Abies. So if you go to a nursery and you're like, hey, I need to look for a fir, it's Abies. So they don't get confused. If you'll just remember that name, the genus of Abies is fir. The genus of pine is Pinus. And then the genus for spruce is Picea. Okay, and so you'll kind of that'll help you remember as you go along here. But spruces also have quite a lot of variation, quite a lot of interest. Let's talk about Norway spruce. This is a very, very common spruce in the industry. And I've shown here through some pictures a few of the cultivations that you can kind of see. You've got some weeping varieties, you've got some more columnar, smaller, shorter varieties, even the rounded little mounded shapes, all from the same Picea, Abies, and then a cultivated variety beyond that. So all of these are Norway spruces. They're all basically the same. other than they've been cultivated a little differently. Now, this is probably a good point to talk about cultivation is, we were talking about this here at work today, is the way a lot of these are cultivated is people are out in the wild, out in nature where these naturally grow, and they'll see an anomaly in one of the species plants. And so they'll take some cuttings, they'll get some cuttings. We had one of USU's main tree guides said that if it was too high, they'd often take a shotgun and they'd shoot up into the tree and it'd break off some branches, and then they could take those cuttings back and then they grow them. They use rooting hormones and different things, and they'll propagate and grow those cuttings. And then those, because the genetic makeup of those cuttings has that unique characteristic, and that characteristic is carried on through cuttings. And so a lot of these cultivations come because of natural mutations that have happened, and then they're just cultivated and grown from cuttings. But you'll see that happen a lot, and it's happening more and more. Just the different characteristics and all kinds of range of different options to choose from. But Norway spruces are great, dark foliage. Again, with spruces, they're more pokey. They're not nearly as soft textured, but they're great specimen plants. They work great in a landscape. The large ones, if you have a large property or something, you needed a windbreak, Norway spruces would work great for a windbreak, assuming they're in the right place. Let's talk about Colorado blue spruce. This one, of course, is known for its just really bright, contrasting blue color, silvery blue-gray. And it's heavily used because of that strong pyramidal shape and very silvery blue color. But because it's so commonly used, different agriculture extension universities have started to discover there's starting to be a few more issues with Colorado blue spruce, the species of it, because it's just been so common. So bug adaptations are happening, scales and different things that can affect some of these evergreens is starting to happen a little bit more and more. But on the cultivated varieties, there's still some less of a problem. So if you want a giant blue, silvery blue tree, you might want to use a white fir. And then if you just love blue spruces, use some of the cultivars of blue spruces. That'll be shorter, that'll be smaller, more suitable to our residential landscapes. White spruce, Picea glauca, this is bluish needles, very attractive. The species of this can get really large. There are some, no, I didn't, yep, I did. So here's white spruce, here's weeping white spruce. So this is exactly the same species plant. Here's the cultivation of it. More narrow, a little shorter, a little bit more suitable to a residential landscape with a little bit more unique look. It kind of weeps a little bit, a little drooping form. And these are beautiful too. I've planted a couple of these in my yard just a year or so ago. Since I planted them, they've put on probably about 8 inches of growth in a year. So I'm kind of hoping that they'll maybe take off even a little bit faster than that. But the mature height on these, if you see one of these at maturity, they're really kind of cool, stately looking trees, neat specimen plants, and again, suitable for a residential landscape. But they love full sun, average soil conditions. Columnar Wells blue black spruce. Here's a cultivation of Picea mariana. It's just the fastigia, it means it's upright. So this is a columnar shape. And great for areas where where you're up next to a structure, you need some different things, in different spaces. Maybe it's a side yard that's tight, it's taller than most soils, hardy to zone 4. So a good option for a columnar variety of spruce. And this is a pretty common one. You see a lot of these more and more as if you drive around in newer subdivisions and where landscapers have done some work. You're going to see a lot more columnar varieties of trees. You're not seeing a lot of the species trees, and some nurseries don't even carry them. They're only carrying cultivated varieties simply because our landscapes are shrinking and nobody's going to buy those giant trees anymore. Serbian spruce is also a really great option. It kind of has a little bit of a droopy look, not drooping, weeping, but the branches tend to kind of just, as that picture kind of shows, it kind of droops down first and then up first. But it does have a nice pyramidal shape, large, the species tree is large. This one does a little better in alkaline soils. This would kind of be that heavier, more alkaline as opposed to acidic soils. but it does still like drainage, so you don't want to flood these. They don't do well. And then this contorted weird picture thing that I've shown here in the bottom, that variety of pendula bruns, that will give you some unique look. Anytime you get a cultivation, it's going to have a very unique look to it. And it can give you some characteristics where you almost don't recognize these as being the same genus, you know, same species even, just cultivated with a unique mutation of some sort. But anyway, Serbian spruce is a really good option locally for the Wasatch Front. So I've kind of gone through that fairly quickly. We covered pines, we covered spruces, we covered firs. If there's any questions, type those in, and I can be answering those. I'm going to turn time over to Robin again, and she's going to cover some junipers, the next couple sections of junipers, yews, and cedars, and then we're going to kind of wrap some things up with some non-conifer type evergreens as we go forward.
Yeah, as Dave had mentioned earlier regarding the junipers having such a bad rap, you know, based on old varieties, like everyone knows about Fitzers and have talked about Fitzers, but there are really some great selections and colors, you know, that we can have a nice variety to choose from. And I'm excited to talk about the junipers because I'm going to begin to be an advocate for trying new junipers in your landscape. So here, our first example is the Chinese juniper. I have a lag in my, there we go. The Chinese juniper. As you can see, there's like different colors, different textures. That Dobbs frosted has that really lovely yellow that Dave was talking about earlier in the presentation about how we're seeing more of these evergreens with that nice yellow option that is intentional. And this can be a nice replacement for a cypress where, you know, conditions for other cypress are not necessarily ideal. We also have that Shimpaku is quite nice. So the common juniper, they can have upright, very low to the ground. Again, you have varieties there, selections that are very conical, slender, have that height in the landscape. And then again, with the other, like the pine, the spruce, the fir, we do have the cultivars that will grow shorter and fit more nicely and compact within the landscape. Here's some great examples of the horizontal or creeping juniper, and you will see that there's like that nice blue, the green silver variety, and a very nice green. Can arrange in the textures as well. So if you do have a nice large swath of landscape like a hill, a very nice ground cover. Here we have the skyrocket juniper. Yet again, a very nice choice for something that's going to be tall and slender. It's part to full sun. Also looks like it's very aromatic and has a nice, which is kind of nice in the landscape to walk by something and take a brush on it and being able to smell that wonderful juniper smell. Here we have the blue star juniper. It's cultivated from a fairly large tree, and this is a very nice dwarf globe-shaped mound. And again, the foliage is that really nice silver blue, and it looks like it changes to a beautiful purplish blue in winter. Another very compact, low-growing option. Here we have a nice montage of uses of juniper and also how structural you can make it. This is a variety where it looks like you'll be able to go in if you want a more structured look and to do some pruning to how you would like. Yews. So we have a couple slides regarding yews. Yews are a great evergreen for shaded spaces, and they do produce an edible berry. There are several varieties and cultivations that are shorter, taller, so a lot of good selection for different uses within your space. Our first yew we're going to talk about is this dark green spreading yew. It looks like it can get up to 4 feet in height, yet can spread to 6 feet. It performs super well in full sun or full shade, and best grown in moist conditions. But that dark green, the dark green needles are so beautiful, and I think underneath, you know, these trees above are quite nice. Here is the Hicks upright yew, and this can be used as a very structured fencing or something, or barrier in the landscape. The branches are so dense, and this dark green foliage is you know, just nice hedging for the garden. Now we have cedars. These are the true cedars hail from the Mediterranean and Western Himalayas. They are quite a unique specimen in the landscape. Our first example for the cedar is this Atlas cedar. Great color, very narrow upright form. Can grow upward of more than 15 inches per year. So pretty fast growing, 25 feet tall. So not, you know, as tall as those 50 to 70 feet. So it could be also a great option in your landscape. This horseman blue Atlas cedar is a semi-dwarf. That icy blue foliage is compact, and again, I think would be quite stunning in the landscape. This can be used as a really nice specimen tree, something to highlight. And then the blue Atlas cedar, this can be a very large option in the landscape, pyramidal shaped tree, but also we do have the weeping varieties that as a specimen would be so beautiful in your landscape. It looks it's just so elegant and structural. I love the weeping variety of these blue Atlas cedars. The Deodara cedar, typical upright, has that long silvery gray needles. And again, I think with these cedars, the structure is just so interesting and just a great addition to your garden. And here we have the very stately cedar of Lebanon, just this wonderful, beautiful tree. The quality of wood has been used, you know, for centuries for building, and it's just a magnificent specimen of a cedar. So here we have the Cypress, and I think that Dave was gonna take over and talk a little bit more about the Cypress. And Dave, if you have anything you wanted to add with the things I covered, please feel free.
Yeah, no, thanks, Robin. So I was just going to say one thing. I'm going to jump back just one slide to the cedar of Lebanon. This is a huge tree. Cool tree, but I don't think I've ever seen one like this here. Although, funny enough, they do sell a cedar of Lebanon. It's a cultivation that you can grow here in our areas. I don't think you'll ever find the true species sold in a nursery here, just because there's not a lot of sites that are going to accommodate such a large tree. But cool tree. If you wanted a cultivation of that one as a specimen, it would be worth growing. Super hardy, super great. Anyway, Cypress. So anyway, if any of you have any questions as well on the junipers, the yews, and the cedars, we just showed a small sampling. Again, there's so many cultivations, so many varieties of these things. I will say on the yews, those are a variety, that's a group that tolerates shade. So if you need an evergreen in a shady spot that's pretty much shaded all day, the yew will be your best option for that. Most of the others are going to prefer sun to part sun or part shade, but don't really thrive when you have full sun or full shade conditions. But the yews, they can thrive in a full shade condition. So keep that one in mind. So the cypress, about a 12 species group of timber, ornamental and timber evergreens. There's the false cypress that and Robin kind of touched on this on the dwarf varieties. A false cypress is simply part of the same family, but not part of the same species. And so they're very similar look, very similar look, very similar characteristics, but they're slightly, it's almost like you had, you know, a division back here and now kind of two family lines. You have Cypress and false Cypress. But then the Nootka Cypress, this one pictured. Now the Cypress are interesting because they have a kind of a different kind of needle. It's evergreen and it's needle and they produce little cones and different things, but it's kind of a flattened fan-shaped type needles, I guess you could say. Just very different, very unique. But this one's a very nice conical shape. I mean, you look at that picture and the different texture as opposed to one of the firs, the spruces or the pines, and the different, just the needles and the different kind of structure and texture of that is why you would use different varieties like a cypress to achieve a different look, a different texture. These are low maintenance, prefer low water. Again, well-drained sites are best. Here's a compact Hinoki cypress. This would kind of more fit in that dwarf group that we talked about earlier, but you know, very, very slow, 1 to 5 inches per year. Maximum height about 12 to 15 feet, 3 feet wide, but these are going to take a long time. I planted a cypress just to get some experience with these. I planted a little cypress and I struggle with it getting a little bit of winter burn. By where I've put it, it gets just a little bit of winter burn every year. It recovers just fine, but it's been so slow. I bet it's only grown an inch in maybe the last 2 years. And maybe it's because I do keep things fairly lean on the water, but nice little tree. And the one I have looks a lot like the picture on the bottom of this slide. But nice little trees, different texture, different look, kind of an interesting specimen tree. Leland cypress, these are upright, dense, very, very nice, dense, fast growers. These will be used for screening, privacy screening. You can hedge these a little bit. They tolerate most soils. The only condition is they won't really thrive in extreme heat. They're going to need a little extra water under extreme heat to look good. And as I mentioned with mine having a little bit of burn or struggling slower, I probably deprive it of a little too much water, and so it struggles through the heat, and so it's not growing as fast. And so if you give them a little extra water in the summer months, they will grow as they're supposed to grow, but nice, dense, thick, good privacy screening that's not going to be overwhelming and huge at maturity. You know, you don't have to worry about a 50-foot tall tree that thins at the bottom or anything like that. Fern spray false cypress, as you can see in this picture, they're very flattened. How the structure of the foliage comes out very, very flattened, very soft fern-like. And I've included some of these. I tried to get some plant lists and different things from local nurseries, in addition to some wholesale growers. And there are things being grown that are not sold here. But if you know about them and you get online and you start doing some searching, you can find some great plants and then go to the nurseries and ask them. And then they can certainly contact their growers in the Pacific Northwest and different places, and they can bring some of those in that will be certainly suitable to our climate, so to our soils. They're just not that common, so maybe the nurseries don't feel like it's worth bringing a lot of them here because they weren't not sure if they'll sell. But if you have enough interest, take it to the nursery. They will bring plants in that meet your needs and your desires, and they'll bring them specifically for you if you want. So this is the last slide on the cypress because there's a lot of them, but this gives you a sampling of the types of trees they are and shrubs, the cultivations. There's a whole bunch of cypress, there's a whole bunch of false cypress that are dwarf, that are a little larger, good trees. Now the cypress can sometimes be confused with the next group that I'm going to talk about, and that's the Arborvitae. Notice again the upright texture, kind of a flattened needle, if you call it that. They are a needle, but it's a flattened type of thing. But these are good, fast growers, Arborvitae. They're good for hedge plantings and screening. Deer have been known to eat them on winters where they're a little more hungry. And on heavy snow, depending on the variety, the cultivation of Arborvitae, they can also tend to be flopping open a bit and get, you know, a little bit unsightly because they flop open, the snow's weighing on them, and they don't respond back super well. They don't rebound. So a light wrapping of your Arborvitaes will help keep that from happening. And you've probably seen that as you drive around sometimes early winter, late fall, you'll see some of these trees wrapped in like a little burlap wrap, not tight, they're loosely wrapped just to keep those branches from spreading out and falling. Emerald green is a very common one. This is a very nice semi-dwarf, very narrow, pyramidal shape, 7 to 15 feet tall at its max. So, you know, you're gonna, depending on the conditions, it could be a little smaller than that for you, or it could be, you know, at that maximum size, but it's a great screening or little foundation plant, some sort of an accent up against a structure, a wall, you know. These prefer mostly moist soils. As I mentioned, some of these, they need some fairly regular watering. So you'd want to put it in a place where it gets decent amount of water. Not overwater, not soggy, just a decent amount to keep it thriving and looking its best. See, I like this picture because it kind of shows what these kind of things are capable of. They're taller, but they're narrow. They have a unique texture to them, unlike the other needled conifers. But tall, narrow form, perfect between buildings. This one's called De Groot's Spire Arborvitae, and this one turns a slight purple in the winter. You're going to always, even with evergreens, even though they don't drop all their needles all the time, you are going to end up with some needle drop and some inside stuff dying. As it grows, you'll still end up with some debris underneath trees. You all know this from looking under trees. There's pine needles, there's dead material. Needles, they'll actually cast off old ones. There's a needle drop every kind of year, every year at a certain time, whereas the older needles kind of drop on, new drop off, new needles are growing. So kind of expect that no matter what on these types of trees, you are still going to have some dead material, some fall material, but not losing them all at once. But this one, maximum 20 feet tall, 4 to 5 feet wide, slow grower. But nice for just lining up against a building, lining a narrow walkway, architecturally framing something. Nice type of plants for that. Now, that I don't have a lot on Arborvitae, and then I'm going to kind of skip into some trees that are a little bit more unique, and their genus name is different. So even though this one says bald cypress, it's not like the other cypress. It's different. It's a taxodium genus instead of the other, and they have different characteristics, although they have some similar characteristics. Now, before I do that though, if there's any questions about Arborvitae, if we went through that kind of fast, type in your question, we'll get those answered, but we'll keep going here because I've got a few more kind of odd, some that don't really fit in their own group. They're just very unique kind of specimen trees, their own genus. And then I'm going to get into the non-conifer, the non-needle bearing evergreens. So more, you kind of refer to them as deciduous evergreens, but they're not deciduous because they don't drop their leaves. But a bald cypress, really unique plant. We've got one of these in the garden. Great tree. It can get very large, 50 to 70 feet, 20 to 30 feet wide, likes full sun. But notice the picture. One's bright green, one's brown. This tree is so crazy. It's evergreen, but it turns brown and drops its needles in the winter. So you'd kind of say, wait a minute, that's not evergreen. Well, I guess truly it's not. It drops its drops its needles. They all turn brown and some of them, they fall off. Not 100%, but most of them fall off. And in the spring, it regrows everything and it looks beautiful again. So this could be mistaken for a dead pine, a dead evergreen, a dead spruce, something. You're like, wow, something's wrong with your tree, it's brown. On the bald cypress, they do that, and but a beautiful tree. We've got one here. If you want to look at, see what this looks like as far as the needle texture, come and check this one out here in our garden. You can get a feel for that. Right now, the one we have is probably 15 feet, maybe 12, 15 feet tall, 6 feet wide, maybe. Really cool tree. Blue giant sequoia. You probably all seen pictures or been to the redwood forest, the giant sequoias. This is a relative of the giant sequoia, and it grows here. It's hardy to zone 4. Very nice specimen plant. I mean, if you look at the different pictures I provided on the screen here, I think this is a cool tree. I would grow one of these. I haven't grown one. I probably have room for one, and I should probably grow one just because they're such a cool specimen. You can get the kind of a weeping variety that looks like some sort of monster. I've seen a couple of those. It almost looks like, you know, a dinosaur if placed with other plants. You got the big long neck stretching out of the foliage or something. You know, there's some very interesting things. But these are very long-lived trees under perfect conditions. I shouldn't say perfect, but good conditions. This tree could live for 200 years. Just a really neat tree, great blue foliage on the blue giant sequoia. So if you have the space, you want a cool specimen tree to talk about with your neighbors, that's a good one. So let's move into the non-needled evergreens. Quite a range of plants, mostly shrubs that are not going to have needles, that are evergreen, and they provide that year-round interest in the landscape. So let's talk about curly-leaf mountain mahogany, or little leaf mountain mahogany. This is an evergreen shrub native to Utah, up in the foothills. Does have a flower, but it's not showy. It likes full sun. It can grow to 12 feet tall, and it can eventually actually become a tree. I've seen in the wild in Box Elder County where mountain mahogany has been browsed on by deer in the lower levels, and it basically created a tree, multi-stem tree, up with a canopy, and just amazing, beautiful little plants. In the landscape though, these are gonna be shrubs, and you're gonna expect a 6 to 10 feet, maybe 12 feet tall shrub, 5 to 10 feet wide. If you live in a deer-prone area, they would browse on these a little if they're hungry. But a great plant, native, very low water, so forth. Suitable for here. We've got some of these in the garden here. Green velvet boxwood. Now, I'm only showing a couple of boxwoods. There's a lot of different variety or cultivation of boxwoods. They're going to grow to different size and different heights, different width. Some are going to have a little different characteristics of color. Little lighter greens to darker greens. They hold their color in the winter. They're minimal maintenance. They can be sheared or hedged or pruned, and they'll respond and grow back and thicken. They're thick and dense. If you like this, some are going to be more naturally globe-shaped. Some would have to be pruned to be globe-shaped. But the green velvet, it's more of a globe-shape boxwood. Like I mentioned in the slide, there's lots of boxwoods. Some are larger, some are smaller. If you're looking for a hedge type or it's just something really dense and a little mounded that stays green, that's not a needle bearer, boxwood is a good choice, although they would need a little more water in the summer months. They could get probably a leaf burn, margin burn, heat stress. You see these sometimes in partial shaded areas as well, and they'll do okay in that shade. Boxleaf euonymus. Now, again, I'm only showing one euonymus here. There's lots of euonymus that do well. And I've tried to show here a couple pictures with some of that variation in color, the variegation that happens in the leaf colors. And you're going to have different sizes. You're going to have kind of the rounded, the very compact, to a little bit taller. This particular one, boxleaf, is rounded and very compact with dark green leaves. It's the picture on the bigger picture on your screen, far left. And it can be grown in containers. It needs regular watering, but it's a great little evergreen shrub with a nice texture. But if you like euonymus, there's some upright varieties that'll be more upright shrubs. Again, they don't lose their leaves in the winter, so they provide that interesting color or texture that you're choosing all year long. Here's an upright variety. Green spire, 6 to 8 feet tall. It can be hedged a little bit. For narrow hedges, it naturally is kind of more narrow. So if you wanted a hedge, you'd plant them fairly close together. They can be 1 to 2 feet wide, so you'd be planting one, every 2 feet or so, and provide a year-round screen. If you don't need anything maybe taller than six or so feet. If you didn't want a wood or vinyl fence or something, you could maybe grow these in to be a natural fence that would be green all year. So it's something to consider, in that kind of situation. And here's even some others. Now, holly, I don't have a lot of pictures of other varieties of holly, but there are lots of varieties of holly. Most people know holly because it has that unique leaf and it looks really cool, but it's prickly. You don't want to be in it. It's not a plant you want to mess with. But this one, narrow columnar dark form all year, it doesn't have those sharp points on the leaves like the other hollies. So in a way, it's much like a boxwood type plant more than a holly because the leaves aren't so sharp to mess with, but this is going to give you the height, 6 to 8 feet tall, 2 to 3 feet wide. Just for structure, upright look. It's not a needle type plant, a conifer type plant. So a good choice. Thrown in here, creeping Oregon grape. some people would think of these as maybe weeds. These are natural understory plants. This is a native plant to Utah. It's found in the understory, tolerates sun, tolerates shade, tolerates low water, tolerates a little bit high water. It produces the edible blueberry, the nice yellow flower in the spring, and it goes a bronzy purpley in the fall. So it has a lot of very, very nice characteristics of plants that we're searching for in a landscape. Flowers, a fruit, and nice fall color, but it doesn't drop its leaves. It does kind of have that little serrated edge, kind of like a holly. It's not nearly as sharp or as prickly, but it does have that. But a good choice, a nice option for a lower water, an understory plant. It does say spreading because they can spread out a little bit. Usually stays pretty short. I've seen a lot of these that are around a foot to 18 inches tall. Nice little plant. And the berries, I've eaten those berries before. They're not something you'd probably just continue to eat. They're not, it's not like picking in raspberries or something like, oh, these are so good, but they're tolerable, they're palatable, they're not terrible, and suitable to, you wouldn't worry about your kids eating them or something like that. Kinnikinick or bearberry. So this is a great little prostrate, low to the ground evergreen, mounded, moderate growth. This stays fairly short, about a foot tall and 4 to 6 feet wide. We've got several of these in the garden. So if you were interested in coming, it does flower in the spring, very insignificant, not super showy. If you know when they're flowering, you can identify the flower. It's very small, but then it does end up producing a little berry. But this is a woody shrub, nice, low to the ground, very dense, drought tolerant, but could stand to have a little extra water. But if you want to come and see these, you can. There's several varieties of kinnikinick. Some of them are more upright, bigger leaves, lots of different things happening in the cultivations of those. But the one I'm showing here is the nice low to the ground, nice ground cover type kinnikinick. And then, there's more. There's a lot more, but for sake of time and going through all these, I tried to just show kind of a little hodgepodge, a little smattering, spearing, whatever of different pictures here of different evergreens. So you could grow yucca as an evergreen. You've got English ivy, which, be careful, if you start growing ivies, you may regret it unless you have just the right spot for it. And you have room to let it go. It's going to be, have some boundary and containment. You're not going to create enemies with your neighbors or something like that, or have it climbing inside your house or something like that. Be careful there. But Daphne, a picture to the top and the right, Daphnes, there's lots of good Daphnes that are evergreens. It's a little harder to find them. Some of them aren't being cultivated nearly as much or sold in nurseries. But lavender's a fairly good evergreen plant. I mean, it tends to die back a little bit, turn a little brown, go dormant, but it still has a decent look through the winter. Boxwoods, we've already talked about. Laurels, you could grow. Ice plant, I've got two pictures here, a purple hardy ice plant, a yellow hardy ice plant. The foliage is succulent, it stays evergreen. You could grow creeping phlox, which I don't have a picture of here. Turkish veronica is the stuff on the little flagstone pavers off to the side there. Turkish veronica is a nice darker green foliage that stays green all year. There's a lot of the sedum varieties, vinca. There's lots and lots of plants that actually serve as an evergreen purpose that you can grow. Now, a lot of them are kind of either really low growers, ground covers, or kind of that boxwood type, shorter mounded shrubs. But it gives a good option and quite a bit of variety for what you can grow that remains evergreen. And kind of to summarize this up a little bit is the reason, why would we even consider growing evergreens? Well, you consider growing evergreens for a lot of reasons, but I think one of the main reasons is because it provides that unique texture, color, and interest for every season of our year here. And we're in a great location where we have very distinct and nice seasons. Sometimes our spring and fall are very short, and we have very long winter or very long summer. But we have unique seasons, and we have plants that thrive in the spring and do their bloom and their big show, and then thrive in the fall and do their big show. But evergreens more than anything, more than their flowers, more than, you know, some of the characteristics that we're looking for in flowering plants, we're using evergreens for their color year-round, their texture, and that interest that they can bring to a landscape all the time. And so it's, again, thinking about site, how much room do I have, how big do I want this thing to be, you know, and what am I looking for in a characteristic. And as you kind of think about those things, you, like I said in the beginning, you can find a plant that is evergreen that would meet any of those kind of requisitions or those site requirements or desires that you have. And it just requires just a little bit of time, a little bit of looking, going to the nurseries, which hopefully is a fun experience. You go look around, you ask some questions to the nursery staff there. But I think evergreens are a great thing. Sometimes I think they're underutilized or they're not utilized correctly. You know, you just find something that looks really cute in the nursery and plant it, and then 20 years later you regret it. And you're paying somebody to take out a tree that got too big, that got too ugly, that, you know, something. So hopefully this class has been useful. Hopefully you've learned something. I think Janice and Robin have answered questions along the way. But this is the last slide I'll show. Just, I should have probably put more landscapes like this in there to show, you know, look at the texture and the color and interest, and almost everything in here is evergreen. It seems the exception is a few maples, Japanese maples in there with the purple, but everything else is evergreen and different. Oh, yeah, Japanese maples provide a couple different colors in there. But you see the color, the texture, the height differences, all from just different varieties of evergreen plants. And it creates, to me, a very beautiful, very aesthetically pleasing landscape that's going to be there all year. So with that, I think we'll just leave it open for questions for just a minute. And if there's further questions, we'll address them. If not, I know we don't have a huge group today, and we're kind of winding down to the end of the season. And our timing, doing this at 2 o'clock on a Wednesday isn't ideal for a lot of people nowadays anymore. It was early on, it's not. But we're going to continue this time for the rest of the year. Next year, we're hoping things will be very, very different. But upcoming next week, artificial grass, its pros and the cons and how to do it. Some of the different options for artificial grass. And then the following Wednesday will be fall gardening and bulbs, where we'll just talk about all the things to do and be considering for wrapping things up in the fall, and bulbs and how to get those going, planted for next spring's color. So that's what's upcoming for the next 2 weeks. Janice or Robin, anything to add? Okay, I don't think there's anything to add. It doesn't look like there's any more questions. So I guess with that, we'll go ahead and we'll just wrap this one up for today. Thanks for joining us. Appreciate you doing that. If you need this again, look on our website for the recording and the slides probably tomorrow. And we'll hopefully see you again next week. Thanks.